All right, we are live. So, welcome everybody to Dark Academia, episode 7. Some fun op-eds and cultural Marxism. I'm here with my friend Sizzlers All You Can Eat. I am Rich, and welcome to the show. How you doing, Sizzlers?
Doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Been a weird week, sort of, but kind of
It's only
trucking
Wednesday.
through it. What's that?
I said it's only Wednesday.
Yeah, I know, but a lot of times sometimes I start my week on Sunday, and by the time Wednesday rolls around, I'm already like, it's already got me, I'm already ragged.
Yeah, I know. I definitely understand that.
So that's part of the issue, I think. Um, so we have a interesting show here. There's a couple. I don't really do a ton of current events, but we did last time with Kanye Conf because it was kind of a special current event. And there are a couple interesting op eds that were published. Oh, this one was a month ago. And let me see when this other one was. I don't know if there's a date on this one. I don't think there's a date or an author on this other one, but it's got to be close. It's got to be within a. Well, this one was after Elon Musk officially walked into Twitter. So that was within a month, right?
Yeah.
All right. So those are the op eds we want to talk about. And the reason I want to talk about them is they touch on the Supreme Court and law school. And the other one talks about social media and free speech. And social media and free speech are two topics I've written about in the past quite extensively. And then, of course, also censorship. And the idea of uh, the new Supreme Court affecting law schools it's kind of near and dear to my heart because I was in law school once upon a time. And then the other topic that we're going to touch on is it's like an old debate, and we are really late for this debate by like 2, 3, 4 years. I don't know, but essentially at a certain point around the Twitter sphere, various podcasters and writers and commentators started to get this idea that the term cultural Marxism was outdated and we shouldn't use it anymore. And that it was actually more accurately described as cultural capitalism. And I have some strong feelings about that. The feelings have waned over the time because, well, it's so many years removed from when this debate was going on. I didn't weigh in on it too much at the time. I don't know why. I was probably busy. I'm either busy or I just don't care to engage with people who are wrong oftentimes. If you go around spending your life trying to correct everybody you see that's wrong, you wouldn't have time for anything else. But anyway, I thought, hey, let's discuss it now because I've been thinking about it again for no real reason in particular, but I thought it'd be a good time. So we'll go ahead and get started. Do you have the article? Oh, let me put it up on the screen here. 1 second. This is a great title. It's called. It's from Slate, which is you know lefty rag by a guy named Mark Joseph Stern, and it's called "The Supreme Court is Blowing Up Law School Too." Inside the growing furor among professors who have had enough. Did you get a chance to read this one already?
Yeah, I did.
Any like initial, real broad, non-specific thoughts on it?
It's well, I didn't. Law school is more your area, but to me, it's just concerning in the sense that that the bias that's in this, and then the attitudes and sort of like the mental state of the professors that
Yes.
were mentioned in this.
Yeah.
But I'll kind of let you go ahead because this is more your purview. But
All right, so we'll just kind of go through it. The general overview here is, of course, what the title says, and Mr. Stern talks to some professors at different law schools. This first one is at UC Berkeley. Talks to them about what life is like as a law professor in an era where three of the justices are Donald Trump appointees. He has Kavanaugh, Barrett, and Gorsuch. So starts out and it says the professor had held out hope that the court might be this great protector of individual liberties right when we desperately need it to be. Then came 2018. That June, the justices issued Trump versus Hawaii, which upheld the president's entry ban for citizens of 8 countries, 6 of them a Muslim majority. That's when Bridges, the professor, realized that the court is not going to save us. It is going to let Trump do whatever he wants, and it's going to help him get away with it. So the Trump versus Hawaii thing was funny. He had this travel ban from high-risk countries, and the high-risk countries, I believe, that those 8 countries, 6 of which were Muslim majority, were all identified as high risk under the Obama administration. Obama had at some point, or somebody in his somebody in the government had kind of put this study together to find high terror risk nations. And what's interesting about this is, if I recall correctly, the reason some of these countries made it on this list was hostilities towards Israel. So then Donald Trump comes in, wants to do some travel bans for various things, uses this list that was already ready to go from the Obama administration, and immediately liberals start losing their mind because of this idea that 6 of them are Muslim majority countries, so they were calling it the Muslim ban. And it goes through the courts, and the court says, okay, you can do this. And this professor Bridges is obviously very distraught that somehow the court could allow this to happen. This is like the same court that has let a lot of presidents get away with a lot of things historically. And a temporary ban on certain countries deemed to be high terror threats, seems to be egregious to them. I also find it interesting. They made it, 6 of 8, 75% are Muslim majority countries. There's like a lot of Muslim majority countries in the world. I think there's like 50 or so independent, separate countries that have a strong Muslim population that's half or more. So in any event, it's a tremendous amount. It's a huge religion. Huge amount of people are Islamic. So it's like if you were to, and there's a lot of political turmoil and other sorts of things in these countries. A lot of them tend to be developing to one degree or another. And yeah, you get a lot of different activity. You get a lot of strife, whether it's racial or religious or otherwise. Anyway, we'll continue on. Do you have any thoughts on that initial one?
Well, not, I was gonna say this is just sort of an aside, but like the way the spelling of her name, like right off the bat, the first line, the way Kiara is spelled, it's like I'm already just discrediting your opinion, slightly.
Yes,
I know that's kind of screwed up, but yeah, I mean, again, just like the attitude of the court's gonna save us, like how, it's so one sided.
Oh yes, that's a great point.
You're assuming that the court, that everything that you say and do and think is right, and that's what the court should do for you.
Yes, perfect point. Because later somebody, I don't know if it's Bridges or otherwise, but they get into the point of saying it's so clear that the court are just now naked political actors. And
Right.
it's like, okay, so because they didn't do what you wanted, that was a clear naked political action, you're upset. It's like, I want them to be neutral, but also side on what I want for everything. And if they don't, they're political hacks. There's that kind of double think going on. And again, these are law professors at law schools. There's like less than 200 law schools in the country. So what's that on average? 4 or less a state, right? I think there's less than 200. I could be wrong. It can't be too many more than 200. But anyway, there's not a ton of law professors in the country. There's probably there might be more NBA players. I don't know. It's a pretty elite club, and what I like about this article is that it gives the person who didn't go to law school a sort of peek behind the veil to see how these people's minds operate, because you have a perception of law professors and the law in general. And then when you are at law school interacting with these people, or you're following their Twitter feeds, you think, oh, wow, they're just another normie NPC like, anybody else. So for that, it's a very wonderful article for anybody to read. So she continues, 4 years later, the justices completely shattered whatever remaining optimism Bridges could muster about the court by overruling Roe v. Wade and Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. The decision came down on June 21st, and she got a migraine for the first time in a decade. The image of the court as a majestic garden of liberty, she concluded, was a complete lie. And it just wasn't about her own personal feelings. She now had to teach her students about the work of an institution that made her sick to contemplate. Okay. So, and then it goes on, Bridges is not alone. At law schools across the country, thousands of professors of constitutional law, they say that particularly, are currently facing a court, and in their view, has let the mask of neutrality fall off completely. That's a really great line, because the mask of neutrality, they admit, whether they realize or not, that the mask of neutrality was always just that. It was a mask. The courts had in previous generations, really, I still think now, if you read the Dobbs versus Jackson decision, I felt that it was really properly grounded in the law and Constitution, and kind of righting the wrongs of something like Roe v. Wade and a lot of the 14th Amendment stuff that you would see later that came out of the Warren Court. And he was, at no point did they say in this Dobbs v. Jackson, which overruled Roe v. Wade, hey, we're just doing this because we don't want them Democrats killing babies. They didn't say anything like that. It was very, I thought it was very well thought out, well written, and it was, hey, there are some decisions that should be left up to the states to decide. This is one of them. And, and it goes on and on and on as to why that is. And it talks about some of the historic assumptions made in Roe v. Wade that were incorrect, from the first time, and explained why they were kind of kicking this back to the states in a way. So that would be the way, if I was the law professor, I would teach this decision in Dobbs versus Jackson. I wouldn't teach it as like, oh, we just, we have a moral, so some sort of moral qualm with abortion, therefore we wanted to get rid of it. That wasn't how this decision read. To me, it read, we made the court made a mistake in granting kind of in federalizing this issue when it should have been up to state legislatures to decide. So it continues on about this mask of neutrality slipping, and it says the conservative justices are steering head on into the most controversial debates of the day and consistently siding with the Republican Party. Well, That could be true objectively, but if it is true, it's like, what do you think the Warren Court and the Burger Court did for, ever since the 40s up until really recently? They were going headfirst into liberal and Democrat ideas. Not that there's a big delineation there, but I suppose there could be, you could argue one, which we'll get to later. Democrats seem to be more neoliberal than liberals themselves are. But that's, like I said, for a little bit later to talk about. But yeah, did she think all of the Warren Court cases were just, did she think that, by upholding the Constitution, you would federalize abortion? That doesn't make any sense. Or, the Constitution, written at a time when people writing it had slaves, and then later, forcing white people to sell their home and rent to blacks and let blacks into businesses against their will. Like, none of that was in the Constitution. So when liberals like this attack the court, it's always like, oh, they're not upholding the Constitution properly, which they never did to begin with, and they never believed in. And I find that a very, how would you describe that? It's kind of sneaky. It's kind of underhanded. There's probably a term for it when you attack people with these principles that you don't even believe in. Or I think it was in what's the book, the Hillary Clinton's mentor, the Jewish fellow, Rules for Radical, Saul Alinsky. He talked about that. He was like, hey, make people, if they have a standard, hold them to it, but then you just do whatever you want.
Right.
So let's see. Oh yeah, they said this other thing they mentioned. Increasingly, the conservative majority in the court does not even bother to provide any reasons for its decision. That I don't think that's true. I think all of the decisions they've came up with, they've been very well reasoned and grounded, and a lot of them make more sense than liberal decisions, in my opinion. I mean, the way that if you read Dobbs, it makes way more sense than Roe v. Wade of it's being grounded in legal principle. But the author makes notes of these things called the shadow docket, which the shadow docket is this concept. There was a law professor, I think, who coined the term, and it basically refers to the Supreme Court shaping law by the things that aren't really taken up by the court. So if the Supreme Court issues a stay in a lower court, or the things that the court decides to not hear, what these people who talk about the shadow docket, what they're arguing is that by the strategic denial of certain cases coming up. The Supreme Court denies most cases, by the way. If you have a case that you want to take to the Supreme Court, you have to apply, and then you go through this lengthy application process, and you have to submit a whole bunch of documents and a whole bunch of copies of the same documents, and most of them do not get do not get taken up by the court. And I don't know what the percentage is, but it's exceedingly low. It's under 10%. So if you have a case that even qualifies to be heard by the Supreme Court, the odds of the court hearing it are exceedingly low to begin with. So that's kind of something that cuts against this idea of the shadow docket, where the court strategically does things by issuing stays and orders at lower courts and the federal courts lower than themselves, or by not picking up certain cases, they're shaping the law. Yeah, maybe I suppose that could happen, but arguing that it's an actual thing that is consciously done, I don't know if I buy that, only because of the amount that they necessarily have to deny, based on they can only hear so many cases a year anyway. But continuing. So they said, they do all these things without explaining. If it's the case that there is a shadow docket, every court, liberal or conservative, behaves this way. let's see here. It says a version of this question is long dogged the profession, which is the law professor profession, which has fought over the distinction between law and politics for about as long as it has existed. Yeah, that's very true. For decades, however, the court has handed enough victories to both sides of the political spectrum that it avoided a full-on academic revolt against its legitimacy. I don't think that's true. I think for for a lot of years, I mean, there's probably decades where you hardly got anything moving in a conservative direction. I mean, from the Warren Court, you get Brown versus Board, which integrates schools. You get Shelley v. Kramer that integrates neighborhoods. You get Loving versus Virginia that says you cannot outlaw interracial marriages. You get Palmer versus Sadati that says this is an interesting case. A white couple got divorced. The woman then started dating a black guy and had the 3-year-old daughter living with the black guy unmarried in the 80s. The dad took her to court in Florida and said, hey, my ex-wife and is having my daughter live with this random black guy that I don't know. I want to get custody. They granted him custody. It goes up to the Supreme Court under Justice Berger, and they say, no, you can't do that. You have these cases that say you have to give illegal immigrants an education and you have to pay for it. You have all these affirmative action cases. You get gay marriage. What do the conservatives get? They got a couple measly, I shouldn't say measly. It's measly in substance, they're significant, but measly in the number. You get a couple gun cases that go up, Heller and McDonald, that say, oh yeah, you do actually have a Second Amendment and it applies to the states too, not just at the federal level. So yeah, thanks. It's like there's this age-old amendment and it finally gets recognized and that's it. And they say that is some sort of victory, or they say that is supposed to give us the appearance of neutrality. When I look back at all the watershed cases, there are some that are truly neutral, like the Miranda, for example, the Miranda case that says police have to read you your rights and can't kind of abuse you of your right to remain silent and right to counsel. That I don't see that as really necessarily liberal or conservative. That might be a true neutral case where it's, as a citizen, you want to have, right, and maybe doesn't have much isn't charged politically either way, but the rest of those, watershed case after watershed case after watershed case, hugely liberal. And the ones that are more neutral are things like I said, Miranda, or these sort of procedural issues that they're dividing or deciding, kind of dividing up and deciding, not any real substantive issues related to something that are in conservative politics. I mean, can you think of any that you thought, oh, this case was a huge win for conservatives in the conservative zeitgeist and what that they campaign on? I mean, all these other ones were like just kind of standard whine ant, shit lib, almost like Democrat campaign policies at one point.
No, and I outright admit that I'm, pretty ignorant in this area. It's not like I paid attention to a lot of rulings or a lot of traditional politics before, I would say, like, Trump got elected. Mm-hmm. Even after that, I was more so into like the cultural, the culture war type political aspect. But I think with this, it may be that, it's easy to kind of point out, oh, there was, what does it say in this, a cascade of far-right rulings after 2022.
Right.
Simply because once Trump was elected, everything was under the microscope, like, mm-hmm. for the right. And so, like, someone like me, like, not really paying attention to court rulings, not really paying attention historically to, like, what you just mentioned about all these, like, landslide cases. I think it was easy to kind of say, oh, look at all this is happening, because nobody really paid attention to, like, what was going on before that for decades and decades. And it was like, totally left leaning.
Yeah.
So yeah, of course,
That's a
these
good
people are
point.
all of a sudden, yeah, like it's like all of a sudden, oh no, everything is shifted to the right when in reality, we're just drawing attention to it. And of course, like once that's kind of what every administration does, right? You want your players to be working for you. Like we all kind of understand that yes, there is some neutrality to the courts, but I think it would be foolish for anyone to say that they've always been like completely neutral, and it's not like there's some sort of higher power that's kind of going to be they're working towards that or in favor of that, I should say.
Right. Um, this there's a they discuss. Let's see. Give me 1 second here. Court shed long precedents that it's been too quickly to shed. They have another quotes from another professor. This is Serena Maori at UPenn, who expresses disillusionment with Trump versus Hawaii, and her expressed disillusionment was that Anthony Kennedy sided with Trump. That left her deeply shaken. It was weeks before I could bring myself to read the opinions in full. So, Justice Kennedy siding with Trump, that should say to this is not as a appointee, not somebody who's seen as like a hard right wing or even in mainstream sphere or anything. You would think that would signal to this professor at UPenn like, hey, maybe this isn't just a hack political decision. Maybe if you actually look at presidential powers and how they are judging if this executive order was permissive or not, they're looking to see if Congress spoke on it, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it was the right decision. They say, no, I'm shaken and I can't even read the opinion. And the fragility, these people always talk about white fragility. And, there's that famous tweet that said the clitoris has 8,000 nerve endings and it's still not as sensitive as a white man. It's like you couldn't even read words on a paper from the Supreme Court. I mean, there's some stuff out there that you could read that's truly deeply disturbing, but there's never been nothing from the Supreme Court ever falls into that sort of like, I can't even bring myself to read to it. You might read it and be like, this is messed up. This is disgusting. Country's going into a terrible, but to just not even be able to read it kind of boggles my mind. The utter fragility on display here that they will admit to. I mean, these are the people that are basically running the country. They are
Right.
people who, if we could write mean enough words on a paper and force them to read it, they would be perhaps bedridden for months. And that's both cool and bad, because it's bad that they're ruling over us, but it's cool that they're so weak and fragile. I see a glimmer of hope in their fragility here. So Maori goes on, I've always considered myself a deeply patriotic person. My family comes from Eastern Europe and Iran. Both sides I have relatives who took refuge in the U.S. and blah, blah, blah. So American is a beacon of hope and blah, blah, blah. And she was, she was she was crossing the border into Canada when the Hawaii decision came down. And suddenly she felt she did not want to return. So
well, why did you?
And she said, I did not want to go home to my own country, a country I barely recognized. So, back in, like, why did you bother to come back? And, probably because she couldn't afford real estate in Vancouver or Toronto because the Chinese bought it all. And even as a law professor at UPenn, you can't afford it. But so, she doesn't recognize the country because what? Because 8 countries that were deemed to have high levels of terrorist activity by the Obama administration were on a temporary travel ban. Crazy, when you really think about that travel ban, how kind of useless it was. And I mean, I kind of thought it was a really hollow victory. I'm like, okay, so a few countries where people might be violent, but it's like it wasn't even people that are pouring into the country at our southern border, right? It's not like
Right.
he banned people from Mexico and Guatemala. in Puerto Rico and Cuba, where we're getting all these immigrants from. It's just these countries that were, it's like North Korea was one of the ones on the list. Like, how does that help me? Like, I would like to see Somalia be on the list, but whatever. Maori's outlook did not improve as the court took a wrecking ball to her area of expertise. Of course, reproductive rights. So her area of expertise was Roe v. Wade. That doesn't mean she is seriously considering quitting academia. There have certainly been moments over the past few years when anything other than direct political action felt like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, she said. But being a law professor is an incredible privilege, and I love almost every minute of it. In the classroom, she continues, Maori will try to teach decisions such as Dobbs in broader contexts, such as the alarming global erosion of democracy and the convergence of anti-democratic forces that enable the country to thwart majority will. Wow. And she goes on to say these rulings have unsettled the foundational premise of our professional lives. This is incredible.
Yeah, there's a lot in that little paragraph.
Yeah, there's a lot. The most interesting thing to me is that one of the arguments in overturning Roe v. Wade, and one of the arguments that Scalia had in his dissent to Obergefell, which was the gay marriage case, was that the Supreme Court often itself erodes and subverts democracy. And Thomas made this case in Dobbs. He was saying, "Hey, he echoed the Scalia dissent from Obergefell, where he said, "Hey, there are these 9 unelected people who are appointed for life that have nobody above them. They cannot be fired, and they are making a decision for 300 million people who did not get the chance to vote on it. They didn't get the chance to vote for a representative to vote on it. They didn't get a chance to petition a representative for it. They were 300 million people were completely left out of the traditional American democratic process, whether you liked it or not. And the decision was then made up by 9, but only possibly 5 people who are in this ivory tower, detached from the rest of society." So the decision in overturning Roe v. Wade, part of the reasoning behind it was that they wanted democracy to play its course. They basically said in that overruling, "Hey, if you guys all want to vote to make abortion totally legal, go right ahead. We're not going to stop you. We just think that's what should be done. It should not have been put in the hands of the Supreme Court to decide, because this was more a political question than a legal question." And then you have this Maori professor saying this represents anti-democratic forces that thwart the majority will, which is really a misunderstanding, I think, of the whole abortion debate and line of cases from the beginning. And in the global erosion of democracy, same idea. The democracy to them just means like what we liberals want. And anything that isn't what we liberals want is therefore anti-democratic. And there's a schism in those understandings between liberals and mainstream conservatives. Conservatives think they view democracy the same way liberals do, but they don't get what that means. It continues, "If this all sounds a little overstated, consider one example of how disruptive the court sprint to the right has been. Perhaps the most famous facet of the legal education is the bar exam, which almost every prospective lawyer must take to practice law. There are a couple states, I think Wisconsin's one of them, where you don't need to take a bar exam to practice as long as you graduated from a law school. You don't need to take the bar exam. And there was some people who were waived into the bar exam. A couple states waived people in during COVID. I had a modified bar exam. It was online for the first time ever. Anybody took an online at home administered bar exam where your camera was on, and there was all this like, you had to make sure nothing was in your room, and you had to keep the camera on the whole time. And if you looked away from they had this like artificial intelligence monitoring technology that would look at your pupils, and if your eyes were off of the purview of your camera or of your computer screen for more than like 5 seconds, it would flag you as cheating, and then it would get reviewed by a human, and they would pull you in and ask you what you were looking at for those 17 seconds, and if you were cheating. It was wild. But so mine was modified, but I actually had to take the bar exam. A couple states had the bar exam waived. Anyway, as I return to this, it says, the exam does not incorporate the Supreme Court's most recent decisions. Those taken to 2022 were not tested on 2022 rulings. This means exam takers must pretend U.S. law was static over the previous year or risk answering incorrectly by asserting, for instance, that abortion access and Miranda warnings are still a constitutional right. That's an interesting point. And they tell you that in law school, and they say, hey, if something changes, if there's an issue that is on the bar exam, somehow gets changed in a massive overruling or some watershed case, you need to answer it as this date. And I forget what date they told me, but they did tell me, they did warn me that, hey, if something happens, there's a hard date here. And the professors usually look kind of through the Supreme Court case docket, and they will say, nothing really looks like it's coming up. However, for these people who took the 2022 case, they would have had rulings that came down where their professors would have said, hey, if you get tested on some sort of rules regarding abortion, there was Roe v. Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood, and then a whole list of cases that came after. And what those cases were, those cases explained things like unconstitutional limits to abortion access. There was a whole host of cases after those two that were all about what is and what is not an unreasonable access to a woman getting an abortion in states. Because what would happen is states would pass laws. A state passed a law that said you can only have an abortion clinic if it's within like 10 minutes from a hospital or something like that. And well, it turned out that would close most of the abortion clinics in the state. And somebody sued and said this law makes it unreasonably difficult for me to get an abortion. And it went up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court struck down the law and said, no, that was too unreasonable. I think they said it was too unreasonable. Maybe they didn't. And at any point, those are the kind of laws that would happen. Waiting. There was laws about waiting periods, laws about spousal notification. So anything like that came up would potentially have been invalidated by this overruling, but you would still have to answer as if it wasn't overruled. And that's really not a huge deal, legally speaking, because the Supreme Court, the bar exam would ask you questions that might be, what's the majority rule in the country? So you might live in a state that has, a rule that is different than the majority of states, and you learn to both in law school, and they're asking you to apply one but not the other. That's very, very common in law school and studying for the bar exam. So for this to happen wasn't anything crazy. One interesting, there's been another misstatement of a decision here when they said, so abortion access is no longer a constitutional right. Yes, that's true. You might have a right to it, but not a constitutional right. And they said Miranda warnings are not a constitutional right. That's totally not true. What that's referring to is a case called Vega versus Toka. And what that was about is a person, Terrence Toka, was arrested and interrogated by the police, and he was never received any Miranda warnings. So they never said you had the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney. This can and will be used against you. By the way, as an aside, the Miranda warnings are not a script that has to be read verbatim. It's not like the Pledge of Allegiance where it actually has real words. You basically just have to inform somebody of their rights. You can say, hey, shitbag, you should shut the hell up. It's in your best interest legally. If you want an attorney, we'll find an attorney for your broke ass. And if you don't want to talk to us, I guess you don't have to, pissant. You could say, like, you could be as disrespectful as you want. You can kind of say it over a period of time. You just have to make them aware of their rights. Like, everybody thinks because of these legal procedurals that it's like this exact phrase, and if you don't repeat it verbatim, like if you miss a word or you don't pause long enough at a comma, that somebody's Miranda rights were violated. It's not the case. You can just be like, hey, shitbag, you can shut the hell up if you want, and that's that. So anyway, Toka was interrogated. He wrote a confession that was used against him at trial. Okay. However, he was ultimately acquitted, found not guilty. So then later he files suit under a law that allows people to sue federal. You can sue in federal court if police violate constitutional right. It was probably sued under a 1983 provision. And he said, my rights were hurt because I was not read my Miranda rights, and I made a confession. I didn't, and he alleges he didn't know that he could not talk. It goes up to the Supreme Court eventually, and the Supreme Court says that, okay, there's an issue we need to tease apart here. One, your rights could be violated, but that doesn't mean you are owed anything. So the Supreme Court said, in this case, yes, it sounds like your rights were violated, but because ultimately there was an acquittal, you were not actually harmed by it. So you can't sue and collect any damages because ultimately you were not damaged because you were found not guilty. And that's what this Vega versus Toka stands for. In other cases, if your rights were violated and you had a substantial material injury, it just depends on what your injury was, what the right that was violated was, what degree it was violated to, and you may be awarded to some sort of compensation one way or another. In this case, the court's saying no, it's kind of no harm, no foul. You ultimately found not guilty. If he was found guilty, it would be a different story, and that's a different line of cases. But he was found not guilty. So all the court's saying is, hey, if they didn't read you your rights, but you were found not guilty anyway, you can't sue him for violating your rights, because the issue of violating your rights would have been if you ended up in jail when your Miranda rights were violated, but you didn't end up in jail, you were acquitted, so therefore you don't have anything to sue about. When this Toka versus Vega came out, everybody from liberals to, I saw it on like Wignat Telegram, were freaking out. They were saying, you don't have Miranda rights anymore. Miranda's over. This court's just totally trampling on your rights. And the thing is, you still have your Miranda rights, and you still can sue if your rights are violated. This is just an issue. This is a nuanced issue where the court's saying you were violated, but you weren't damaged, because in the end you were found not guilty. You can be violated but not damaged for much. You can have your rights restricted, but like it didn't really cost you anything. There's all sorts of examples I can think of where, I mean, I was at a protest one time in undergrad, and I was being a little bit more wild than I should have been, and the police escorted me off the premises away from this protest. And it was like, did they violate my First Amendment right to be on public property and speak my mind? Yes, they really did. But like, what harm was there in the fact that they escorted me away from the protest, where I was basically just screaming at people, like they were screaming at me, I was screaming at them, like,
Right. Like in the end, it all kind of balanced out.
Yeah. Oh no, they said the stream is frozen in the chat. Is the stream still frozen, guys? I don't know. Hopefully it continued to work. But yeah, so in the end, it kind of balanced it out, because it's like, okay, did they violate my First Amendment rights? Sure. What if I sued that police department for like, what would I say my damages were? Like, what was the cost of them not allowing me?
Yeah,
like they didn't let me yell obscenities at my political opposition in between classes. My damages would have been nothing. I had no, in fact, they probably saved me some trouble, right? So if I went to court, I would say, yes, my First Amendment rights are violated. Absolutely. A police officer isn't supposed to remove you from a protest just because you're saying, like, it just doesn't make any sense. But would I have a lawsuit? No. And that's what this is about. And the fact that a law professor would sort of paint that with such a broad brush is interesting to me. I don't really know what else to say. It's odd. And it kind of shows that these people too are political actors, and the left wing also sensationalizes things, and they sometimes, law professors have an understanding of this that's not really much more nuanced than a normie. Like, what if I came back from that protest and said, there are no more First Amendment rights in the USA. I was not allowed to speak my mind at a protest. That would be a pretty significant sort of exaggeration of what happened, right? Like, I could have got online and said what I had to say about these people. I could have said it somewhere else. I could have went back 30 minutes later when that officer shifted it and started yelling at him. I could have went and put on a disguise and went back and started yelling at him. I could have went and yelled at somebody else. I could have went and passed off. I could have done like a million other things, right? But this little incident here that I didn't get to finish yelling at somebody or whatever it was. And I said, that First Amendment's totally dead. That's obviously incorrect. And that's how I view that here. See, the author goes on to say, the Supreme Court has had turbulent and alarming periods in its history, but since the 1950s, the legal academy has told a particular story about American law with clear heroes and villains. Very interesting. And he goes on to say the Supreme Court was the hero, vindicating the Constitution's grand guarantees of liberty and equality for all, abolishing segregation while guarding against authoritarianism. Very interesting. He goes on to say it's a bastion of freedom, protector of democracy, champion of civil liberties, pure and high-minded manifestations of our nation's noblest values. Well, what if you think forcing, you know, an old lady with a few rental units that she has to rent to people that she knows are going to cause her problems? What if you don't find that as the heroic thing? Or, what if you think deciding that people cannot really have private property isn't heroic or noble? I guess you're on the side of evil. And what they said here is very interesting if you kind of detach the words like noble and evil and good from their traditional meanings and see it as something subjective to them. Same thing with like a bastion of freedom, protector of civil liberties. Like, for whose civil liberties were protected by busing little white kids across the town to the black school where they were picked on and beaten up after Brown versus Board? Like, whose liberties were protected? You protect the rights of black people to access white people at any point in time, no matter what. But is that they seem to think that is more important than the right to be able to be away from who you want or to only associate with who you want. But that is never brought into consideration among these liberal types and these law professors because they think, oh, if you wanted to be just with white people, you were just evil and we don't have to entertain evil. They just dismiss it outright as evil. And I find that telling.
I was going to say it's not even a consideration for them, like from the start. It's they don't even consider that there is, perhaps an alternate view of something. There cannot possibly be someone that disagrees with them or sees something in a different way. It's like we're right. There is no other, right? That's why they can paint such like a black and white of heroes and villains, or freedom or authoritarianism. When in reality, so many things are a gray area, it's not like this is totally black and white, but to them it is, because if you're not with them, you are against them. So
right.
yeah.
This next part also very telling. The problem, it's worth emphasizing, is not that the Supreme Court is issuing decisions which left-leaning professors disagree. It's that the court seems to be reaching many of these conclusions in defiance of centuries of standards, rejecting precedent and moderation in favor of aggressive, partisan-tinged, motivated reasoning. So here they invoke centuries. Is that really what it says? Centuries of standards. And what's astonishing to me is that none of these centuries of standards existed before Eisenhower was president, which was after World War II, and Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren to the court, who was at the time governor of California. So this whole like century of standard thing really only existed post World War II. So, I find that odd. And then also this rejecting precedent thing. Precedent to liberals only works in one way. So, for example, the precedent before Roe v. Wade would have been the states decide abortion. The states decide, it's at the state level if they want abortion or not. That would have been the precedent the whole time. And then Roe v. Wade happens, and then the states can't decide anymore because it's now federally legal. It's constitutionalized. All these cases that deal with racial integration. At the time when Brown versus Board was decided, the thing that it overruled, the Plessy versus Ferguson, was from the turn of the previous century. So it was a 19th century case in standard, and the standard of segregated schools would have preceded that case. So, these people aren't saying, hey, Brown versus Board was a bad decision because it sort of eroded our precedent. It rejected the precedent of segregation. And they wouldn't have said it was partisan tinge motivated reasoning. And they wouldn't have appealed to democracy at the time when all these integration Supreme Court cases happened. The reason they had to do integration in the U.S. through the Supreme Court was because there was no path for it to happen legislatively, meaning there was no democratic solution for them. And they never appeal to all those decisions and say, hey, there was no path for this to happen through democracy, so we have to do it with the court. And that's incredibly authoritarian. All the people are saying, no, we want segregation. States are saying we want segregation. The court, 9 unelected people, just force it on them. And they never view that as authoritarian. Which it all says a lot how they are. It's one thing to like have a position on staked far left or staked far right, but to pretend, like, I don't pretend all my views are totally neutral the way they do. I mean, I think some of them are, but if I was just like, yeah, the standard is to want it to be like, 1850 laws again. I realize that not everyone's going to agree with that, and it's not like maybe a norm at this point. I could maybe modify it and say, well, my views are probably in line with the majority of white Americans in 1850 when there was like 50 million of them or something, right? That might be true, but like it's obviously not true for me to say it about the modern America in 2022. But these people do that without any bit of self-reflection. It's Tiffany Jeffers, another woman at Georgetown University, a prestigious place. It's hard to think about your own profession, the things you were taught, the things you believed in, abruptly coming to an end in rapid succession. So that's her. It's a hard task to ask a law professor to dismantle all the training they had. It's difficult, emotional, psychological transformation process. It's not easy to upend your life's work and not trust the Supreme Court. They were plan trusters, and now it is so over.
This is just so dramatic. I can't.
So dramatic. See, Jeffers said that after the flurry of hard right rulings, many professors had a personal grieving period, which quickly turned to grappling how we teach the students. Man. Okay. Despite the shocking grief, Jeffers has not questioned her decision to become a law professor. I am sure she doesn't. The cushy job, the no real deadlines, the big pay. Yeah, I am sure she doesn't question that. Yeah. To conservative ears, this statement might smack of liberal bias. After all, a triumph of the conservative legal movement, including many conservative professors, has been to cast law as perfectly neutral. That's interesting. There's been a historic. That's been the historic view that the law is perfectly neutral. When I was in law school, they pretty much treated everything as this is neutral. This is just applying the facts to the law and nothing more, not really politically motivated. So let me see how this wraps up here. They said, I've always perceived the law as a tool for justice, and my faith in laws being used towards that end has definitely been shaken. Stripping an entire class of people of fundamental rights without so much as a minimal effort to acknowledge the consequent harms. That's talking about the abortion. So an entire class of people being women, their fundamental right being abortion. I mean, yeah, maybe they didn't acknowledge the harms. That's probably true. I'll give her that. There's probably some issues surrounding abortion that weren't fully considered. However, the court in this decision didn't see it as their job, because it wasn't about whether it's harmful or good for society or harmful or good for women. They were looking at the law. Is this in the purview of the Supreme Court, or should this be a legislative decision left to states? That's what it was about. And see, they missed that point again, which I don't think a law professor should have. Another professor says Segal lost faith in the Supreme Court a long time ago. Okay, that's cool. Let's see anything. He talks legal realism, which is a view that Supreme Court and other justices are indeed political actors, not just purely applying facts to law. Let's see. There's a law professor who went ahead and retired early. So others said a class, Bridges, candidly discussed the enormous challenges facing the legal profession today. The students were angry and fearful, yet readily offered ideas to help tackle the current crisis head on. I always leave class feeling great. It's like therapy. That's a perfect ending for this. The law schools are filled with Dumbledore's army ready to go tackle the evil. And it was like a therapy session for everybody involved, which what more could you ask for? All right. Thoughts on that thing was like a ride, man. These people were wild.
Right. How many professors would you say were like overly liberal, or at least showed any sort of bias, versus fairly rational, fairly neutral, like that you had?
Well, they were all pretty liberal. One was a high-ranking GOP guy who was not so much liberal as clueless as to like he wouldn't talk about race or demographics. And if you did, we talked in private a few times, and his view was like, well, we just need to get the Mexicans to vote Republican and that'll fix it. And, one of those types. I had one guy who was actually super interesting. He was kind of a moderate, really, or maybe an extreme moderate in a way. And he was actually, I would say, less than being political. He was very open-minded. He was like one of these dudes that he was an interesting guy. He was in really good. He was old. He was like 70 something, but he was in really great shape physically. Probably looked like he was in his 50s. Dude probably did like a lot of mushrooms and stuff. Just super open-minded, really willing to look at all sides of it, and that he did not have. I learned that I like that approach more than I like the hard GOP stance, or maybe even hard right-wing stance in some ways, because what I found interesting about him was that he would be totally open-minded to all sides, then kind of come to the same or similar conclusion that I was coming to from just a hard right stance. But I liked how he got there. I appreciated his methodology of getting there. And that was helpful. But most of them were pretty far liberal or pretty much like Democrat ideologues in one way or another. It didn't always come out. Sometimes they would just stick to, like, if it was torts, it was like, there's not a whole lot to say politically, and they would stick to it, which is unlike undergrad, where I would be in a math class and somebody would somehow bring up how much they hate Trump. So that was interesting. They were able to stick to it a decent amount and not make it horrible. But overall, they were all really pretty liberal, and I think these decisions probably bothered most of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think in reading this and kind of, I mean, within all of university, every department, this is another kind of an aside, but since we brought it up last time and it's an issue that, our people, I guess, right-wing people talk about, is like the Jewish domination of banking. Well, how about the Jewish domination of like education, higher education?
Yeah,
and all these departments.
Yeah, that was real in law school.
Yeah, it's like a big thing, but and that's a whole other topic. But I think within certain areas like law, like medicine, these areas where they're professional degrees, where you go on and you are, especially with law, you're kind of expected to weigh out cases and see multiple sides of things and like look at the facts, apply the law, and kind of hold your own opinions and your own feelings. Whereas this article highlights how much of these people's opinions and feelings and political biases go into their everyday life, their attitude towards law.
Yeah, it's some of them seem to have a hard time separating their view, and I think the value in this article is, I mean, it's an interesting little peek behind the curtain, but it's also, you can look at these people and see why they're ridiculous and the errors in the way they think about things, and you can apply that to yourself, and you can think, okay, is there anything that I'm looking at politically, culturally, in modernity, otherwise, that is similar to the way this professor is saying you don't have Miranda rights anymore because one little section of damages for Miranda didn't go the way she wanted. So, is there anything, I think, is there anything people do in general? Is there anything I do? Is there anything people who are commentators that I might happen to like? Like, these are ultimately, a lot of these are blind spots. And it's like, do I have any blind spot where I'm just so dogmatic I can't even think straight? Because that's what's happening here. These people are so dogmatic and so liberal, they can't even they can't even honestly say what a case stands for. And that's dangerous when you're to the point of being such an ideologue, you can't even tell somebody the truth about what something means. So like, I don't want to be in a position. I want to be a right-wing extremist, sure, but I want to be like the most illiberal person anybody's come across, sure. However, I don't want to get to the point where if you ask me what a Supreme Court case stands for, I can't even give you the honest shake because I'm like so caught up in my own illiberal attitudes.
Right. When there's like a clear objective truth that
Yes.
you are unwilling to see
Yeah.
or acknowledge because of you got your blinders on. Yeah.
That's the issue. I don't want to get to the point where there's some objective reality that maybe somebody needs to get to for whatever reason, and I can't even get there to tell them and accurately convey what something means, what text on a page means, or what a law means, or whatever, because I'm so blind, or I can't see the good in something, or I can't see the opportunity in something. Like there could be things that suck, but there's an opportunity to make money, an opportunity to make friends, an opportunity to influence people, an opportunity, whatever, right? You could be in a total shit show and there could be opportunities, but if you're too blinded by we're in this shit show, you're going to miss all the opportunities. And this article really kind of helped me center and like think about the way I think and view a situation or opportunity. So I thought it was worth doing a show on because it was so valuable. Let's jump over to the next topic. I think we will mostly. I think we're gonna let's do a really quick run on this free speech one. Okay.
Okay. This one's so hyperbolic too.
Yeah, it's even worse. Let's see. All right, this one is titled Elon Bros. Oh, there's a picture of Elon and Us and my favorite German painter, Austrian painter. Elon Bros are killing us with free speech. This is an interesting article. I want to be cruel, but the mods won't let me, is their best argument for free speech because it's about something far more sinister. I don't know that, I don't think that's an actual quote of anybody saying that. That's just sort of their view of why people want free speech, which, okay, that's probably not true, but it's telling. Or, yeah, it's telling. Beautiful tweet. I love this by Jeff Jarvis. Today on Twitter feels like the last evening in a Berlin nightclub at the twilight of Weimar, Germany. He's basically saying we're in 1933. Hitler got elected. The party is over. There's numerous articles about what nightclubs in Weimar, Germany were like. There's books on it. They're fascinating. They're troubling. All kinds of debauchery was going on in these nightclubs. Like the most horrific things ever. You could get child prostitutes. You could get mother and child prostitutes. You could get there were people who would rent you animals to have sex with. It was a terrible time in German history, and I'm glad it's over. But Jeff Jarvis views, and a lot of liberals view Weimar Germany as sort of this pinnacle of freedom and expression. And maybe to them it was, but this highlights something important about societies, and it's why, like, I'm going to write about this in an upcoming book, but it's why things like liberty and freedom are sort of useless abstractions without a more concrete definition. Because if I say I want freedom and Jeff Jarvis says he wants freedom, well, Jeff Jarvis wants to fuck donkeys in a Weimar nightclub. I want the freedom to round those people up and put them in cattle cars. So what we both want with the word freedom, way different, right? So with that said, they continue on, which that's their view of how Twitter is now. Twitter feels like it's over for us. And if you are on the other side of that Weimar Germany issue, you might think, oh wow, this is great, it's coming back. They have a meme account that says, I'm going to go on a misgendering spree. And they see, and then the author says, these folks are restrained by current moderation that Elon wants to unleash on trans and people of color. They want because abuse and driving folks to suicide is what it boils down to. So they say the only reason people want free speech is so they can abuse trans, people of color, homosexuals, that sort of thing, under the guise of freely exchanging ideas. And they say conservatives, the best argument many conservatives have for free speech is that they want to be as cruel as possible. And that's it.
But I mean, I was reading over that earlier, and that whole statement, like, first of all, it totally escapes like the left, the liberals, that like shit posting and memes. This is obviously not an argument. No one is making a serious argument. Like, all we want to do is what is the quote again?
Be as cruel as possible.
Yeah, be as cruel as possible. That's obviously not an argument. This is like having fun. But these people take it so literally.
And then, yeah, you could. This one says, "I want to behave like an absolute rat bastard." I mean, maybe they got me on that. I don't know. It sounds kind of fun. It sounds like going goblin mode, kind of. You know, it's rat bastard time. It's over for you, Weimar freak. So anyway, this Dr. Laura Hall-Lou, she, her says, academic freedom and freedom of expression are dog whistles for silencing decolonial, anti-racist, trans, inclusive, and other progressive voices. That's not what I don't want. Okay. Well, yes and no. Mostly no. So decolonial, anti-race, trans, inclusive, progressive people, I'm not the fondest
that word salad. Like, what?
Yeah, I'm not the fondest of those people. However, I don't want them kicked off Twitter. I wouldn't like moderators to be like, oh, you're pro-trans, you're banned. I just let me freely interact with them. And the thing is, they view freely interacting with them as harming them because they view words as violence. This is an old argument that they've been using to suppress free speech for a long time, where they say your words aren't just words, they're violence. And that's what that argument is. It says they rejoice over their bonfire, but only halfway so, for the cackling of their bonfire is missing other conservative ingredient, the smell of minorities being burned alive, screaming out. I don't know of any conservatives, or like, no matter how liberal you are, like, do I really want to burn people alive? No, that's kind of, I mean, maybe that's just
such a ridiculous, like, honestly, I think that comes from them. You know, I think that's
I think so.
fantasy that they have.
Yeah, I think that might be their kind of like weird vengeance fan. Like, I don't ever think, oh man, it sure would be great to burn these people alive.
Well, and it goes back to, like, I don't want them kicked off the planet. I don't want anyone censored. You know, I don't want.
Yeah.
I just want to be able to, like you said, interact with them or not interact at all. Just be able to, like, express or say what you want without people coming to attack it or people telling on, like, tattletaling. You know, just mind your own business.
Yes, exactly. I'm just tired of this hall monitor behavior from them. And let's see. This person says people are finally beginning to understand they don't want freedom of speech in the academic sense of the term. Well, I think freedom of speech in the academic sense of the term fully entails being able to misgender somebody if you want, or being able to say a slur if you want. In an age of total political correctness, these are political acts by saying these sort of verboten words. You know, it's not going to be what I'm personally going to do, but if somebody does it, I don't think they should be banned for it. Certainly not fired or have their life ruined over it. And
right. And what are they considering the academic sense of, you know, is this where we go into like hate speech and
maybe I took it as what they meant, like the classical like early arguments in American history for freedom of speech, which were about finding the best ideas, about letting people speak freely, because, you know, there's an argument from autonomy that if you have the right to freely speak, or without being able to freely speak, you don't have control of your own body, which means somebody else has a right over your personal autonomy. There's kind of the marketplace of ideas argument that people tend to dislike online a lot, and I think they only dislike it because the current marketplace of ideas is like a really limited market. But if everybody was able to participate in it, I think it stands on. It has some merits. So, if you basically, I always found the argument from autonomy for free speech very compelling, which is like, if you're saying there's a word or a thing or an idea or criticism I can't say or make, I don't have the freedom to do what I want to do, even though it's not like I'm saying I don't have the freedom to hurt somebody, because another person is obviously infringed by my quote unquote freedom to hurt them, right? But like me just saying things that I believe, where is the actual harm to people in that? I don't think it exists. They think it does exist, but so they're saying they should have a right over my autonomy to be able to control what I say, and I disagree. So even in the academic setting, like I think the argument from bodily autonomy at the academic level for saying crazy things is legitimate. CNN argues that you cannot let these guys control the discourse in this country. We're headed to hell if they let us. And they say we need to look to Europe to censor speech, where Europe doesn't have a profound First Amendment protection like we do in the U.S. This is in. See, they're saying right there, we need to censor people. So no marketplace of ideas, no argument from autonomy. So they're shutting down any sort of the traditional academic arguments in favor of free speech themselves.
Well, and not only that, it's not just like, oh, we need to have censorship. It's like we need to determine what that censorship will be. We need to make the rules here. Like it's always about them putting themselves on the pedestal.
Yeah. It's make us the people who decide free speech because reasons. Here's an interesting tweet. Anti-black colonizer Elon Musk buys platform where black people have exhibited extraordinary cultural and political power is not a coincidence. Weird how folks ignore that vital part. I don't know what extraordinary cultural and political power to which they're referring, other than the fact that like black people tend to be just free to say whatever crazy stuff they want about white people.
Black Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, I think Black Twitter is great, but as far as being like having political power or cultural impact, I don't know. I mean, I think that's just sort of a revisionist tale. She goes on to say, conservatives writ large have systemically chipped at and now reduce free speech to just another sneering excuse for treading on the downtrodden, for whipping the marginalized, for gay bashing the alternative, for incarcerating non-white boys from infancy to grave, from curb stomping black people's skulls open. And here they link a scene from American History X, raping and disparaging transgender Native American women, to which they link an article that talks about how many trans women are killed. Usually trans women are killed by men of their own race, almost always, and for lynching little black boys for merely looking at a white female, linking to the death of Emmett Till on Wikipedia. Yeah. And it says, so no, free speech isn't the right to speak out against power. Free speech is a fucking AR-15 and it's loaded and they're pointing it at our heads with a kind of, what is this, an A2 AR? With a standard AR with no rear sight on it. Has a front sight, no rear sight. Yeah. So, and they will pull the fucking trigger. So they're saying if they give us free speech, it's the same thing as shooting them in the head with an AR-15, which I think is kind of they sort of condemning their own inability to participate in online discourse and let their arguments stand under their own weight. Because if you just let everyone, what they're saying is if you just get everyone free speech, they're dead. That's what they're admitting. Hey, if you give us free speech, we're toast. We're donezo. And that's kind of cool. It's kind of a white pill.
Yeah, right.
So
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty pathetic to think that. I mean, if we're considering adults here, not like kids,
Right.
that you would feel the need to stop everyone or a large percentage of people from simply being online, posting thoughts, posting words, just saying things. I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know. Like you're mentally inferior.
Absolutely. They're mentally weak. Their arguments to the extent that they exist are always ridiculous. And I think they are rightfully fearful of people able to say that to them without being and they will lose. They've had a tremendous amount of power. A shitty little liberal account with like 40 followers is able to use the report button and get somebody who's been on the platform much longer with far more followers and far more impressions is able to get them banned within like an hour of disagreeing with them, and they're losing that power. To what extent we will see under the new ownership, but I think people on our side don't understand the amount of power that they've had. Imagine, having a new account with a few followers and some verified liberal with 50,000 followers disagrees with you and you can just get him banned. That's what was happening to our guys. I mean, my buddy in the chat, RC, he had like, I don't know what he had, 30,000 followers or something like that. Years of tweets, years of building up a significant following. And, some little ridiculous pissant able to get him banned because he disagreed with him. They had power over people who had views that were more popular. They have cultivated followings over years, and that might be going away, and they're terrified. And that was their weapon. And now they're saying we have an AR-15 pointed at their heads because the 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 playing ground might be evened out a bit. Also, super telling. All right, hit those op-eds. They were great. Let's do the last part of our segment, which is.
Do you have? I sent you in the backstage chat. Just
Let me click
I
that here.
always go back to the Tyler the Creator tweet
Oh
about
my gosh.
cyberbullying.
Yes, how is cyberbullying real? He's
I sent a
laughing.
link to that. I don't know if you can
Yes.
throw it up on that.
Yes, how does cyberbullying real? Just close the laptop. Yeah,
Um,
and that was like back in 2011 or 12, right?
yeah, it's
Like it's an old tweet. And Tyler the Creator said, "How the fuck cyberbullying real? Just close the laptop. What are you like serious?" Um, all right, so we're at about an hour and 20 minutes. Let's take 10, 15 minutes to the last segment, which is hopefully only takes that long. Cultural Marxism versus neoliberalism versus cultural capitalism. There was this argument going around from certain circles that cultural Marxism is an inaccurate and outdated description and concept for what we are experiencing, and it should be called neoliberalism or cultural capitalism. And I disagree with that premise for a couple reasons. One, cultural Marxism there's a definitive understanding of what it is in right-wing academic circles. And what it describes is real and legitimate. Two, neoliberalism has an actual, it's an actual term, and you can actually describe it, and you can actually point to policies and things that are neoliberal. Finally, this cultural capitalism thing that people tried to shoehorn in there, and it comes from people who were formerly Marxist or flirt with Marxism, and they like the critique of capitalism, and they try to apply it to places where it doesn't necessarily need applied. And this is something I see left wingers do a lot, where they'll take an issue and they will blame capitalism for it, and it may or may not be the kind of the correct root of the problem. And then I saw that a lot on these people who are in right wing circles. Again, as with we talked about last time, I don't really think They have a true appreciation of hierarchy and beauty and other things that make you kind of fundamentally, metaphysically right wing. But they're in the circles, and you would see their people traffic in these views. So, kind of to start, capitalism itself, from a nationalist perspective, should be attacked, especially in its current state. It's a destructive force that drives globalism. I think it's very harmful to our people and nations. And the way it's been implemented for the last 100 years, really starting with this case that was in the Michigan Supreme Court called Ford versus Dodge. It's from 1919, where the Ford, Henry Ford and the Ford Company, Ford Motor Company, were sued by the Dodge brothers, who were shareholders. They had a bunch of share in Ford. I'm sorry, a bunch of stock in Ford. They sued Ford because Ford was doing things with the money, such as, I can't remember all of the things he was doing. It's been a long time since I read the case. Essentially, giving the workers more benefits, using the money to improve communities, stuff like that. A bit of corporate goodwill. And the Dodge brothers said all profits should go to increasing shareholders' share value. And that the Michigan Supreme Court sided with the Dodge brothers over Ford, and that gave birth to a thing called shareholder primacy. And what that means is that if a company was being run in a way that didn't have the idea of making shareholders as much money as they can at the forefront of their decisions, then the shareholders could sue to make the company make different decisions. So if the company wanted to reinvest in a local community, take care of employees better, or whatever, there was a certain degree of that you were allowed for. And then after that, you might get sued because you weren't making enough money for the shareholders. So this gives birth to the idea of shareholder primacy, which has been super destructive. There's the consequences of it are difficult to even understand. And you see this view of kind of running a company quarter by quarter by quarter without a real concern for sustainability or the long term. You see no concern for it, and it's a result of shareholder primacy. So, with that said, you also have this term neoliberalism that people throw around. Sometimes people use it to mean what maybe should accurately be called cultural Marxism, or to accurately describe something that has happened downstream from shareholder primacy. But what neoliberalism is, it's a sort of political and corporate ideology aimed at a deference to the free market, a political deference to the free market. So a perfect example of that is the 1996 Telecommunications Act. Telecommunications Act was an act that gave restrictions on radio station ownership. The act said something like 40 or 38. One entity could own, 40 or less radio stations. That act was, I'm sorry, there was a law before the act that said, 40 owners, 40 stations, that's it. The 96 Telecommunications Act, put through by Bill Clinton, who's neoliberal, lifted that restriction. So at this point, you had a company that was called iHeartRadio. It later became, it was Clear Channel, then it became iHeartRadio. Prior to 1996, they owned like 38 or 40 stations. After that act passed, lifted the limit of how many stations they were allowed to own. They've bought up to the point where they now own over like 1,300 radio stations across the country. So if you want to get into the radio station business or advertise or do anything involved with radio, instead of having all these local owners who, there might be a company that owns the radio stations in part of New York City and maybe part of whatever city, and then further out somebody else, or you have a sister city with a couple stations and some of the local ones, and one company might own the talk show and some AM and the rock station and maybe the rap station. They syndicate a couple. Well, now anything dealing with radio, you deal with iHeartRadio, and that's because there was the the legislative body in the United States said, let's defer to the free market. Let's not put a restriction on radio ownership. Let's let the free market kind of work itself out. Well, what it did is you just ended up with a monopoly of radio stations. That is very different from what we get into when we talk about cultural Marxism, which was sort of downstream in a degree from the Frankfurt School. You have these people like Marcuse and Adorno who were at Columbia. They got kicked out of Germany in the 30s by the spicy Germans. They come to Columbia. They were Orthodox Marxists. They kicked out of Germany, wind up here, and they still are Orthodox Marxists. So they wanted to do Marxism in the U.S. They want to try to agitate U.S. workers against the ruling caste, the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, right? They wanted to agitate the proletariat with Orthodox Marxism. So they try to tell people, hey, you're being exploited. The excess value of your labor is being taken, and it's all going to these wealthy capitalists and capital owners. You should revolt. Well, the average guy looking around in the 30s can afford a house. He can afford a stay-at-home wife, like 4 or 5 kids. Could probably buy a car because of Henry Ford. And he's thinking, I got it pretty good. I can afford food. My wife stay at home. I got extra money. Can pay off my house. I don't really have much of, not really that agitated against the capital class. The average guy coming out of high school could get a factory job and have a pretty nice life. I'm not really concerned with the way things are materially distributed in the country. So Frankfurt School kind of, in a way, goes back to the drawing board. They still want to agitate for classes against people. They start coming up with a critical theory. You see it in feminism, and then you see it later developed into racial critical theory that happens a couple decades later. What they do is they take the same oppressor-oppressed dynamic, and instead of applying it to workers and capital owner, they apply it to like men and women. They tell women, you're being oppressed by the men and the patriarchy, and you're being oppressed by being a stay-at-home woman, and you need liberated. And it tells blacks that the reason they don't have as much wealth as white people is because white people are oppressing them. There's systemic racism. It's not their fault. So you still have this oppressor-oppressed dynamic, but it now moves from the realm of finances to the realm of culture and race and sex. Now, people say one of the arguments against cultural Marxism being a descriptive term is they will say things like Marcuse and Adorno wrote about high culture and they criticized jazz, and they thought, well, they enjoyed high culture and they were sad to see the decay of popular culture. And they say, well, because of that means cultural Marxism isn't true because Adorno hated jazz and he liked high art. Well, that totally misses the point. And it might be that people are saying things are cultural Marxism when they mean the culture has eroded, which isn't cultural Marxism. And it might, but that doesn't mean this oppressor-oppressed dynamic as it, if you see some sort of feminism study and you see them telling women that they're oppressed by childbirth and being a stay-at-home mom and by men, that's cultural Marxism. And when you see black people talking about white people are oppressing us and systemic racism and white privilege, that's cultural Marxism. It doesn't have anything to do with like the prevailing culture of the day. That may be cultural Marxism. If you see something that's in a movie or a TV show that is displaying white men as the evil oppressor, that right there is a cultural Marxist strain. But something else in it could be influenced by a total different kind of strain of thinking. And these people who argue that like it's all capitalism, for example, that don't understand that some things are capitalism, some things are neoliberalism, some things are cultural Marxism. I don't think like they say it can only be one, but it doesn't. You can have parallel systems in a society operating in tandem. And that's what we have. And it's much more complicated, I think, than just saying, oh, it's just all capitalism. And the argument that it's all capitalism is that the idea of like anti-racism and like the trans stuff and the gender bending is that you're removing them from the culture, because it's like if you have a culture, it's a barrier to buying your culture and just being good little consumer units. And they want you to be purchasing your identity, and they don't want you to have a real identity. But I think that theory falls short in many ways. One being that they push identity for some people, but not for white people. So, you know, if capitalism really just wanted, if we're living under cultural capitalism, as these people posit, I don't think there would be like a Hispanic Heritage Month or a Black History Month, because that undercuts their theory that they want us to all be this gray mass of consumer units. They don't really want us to be all the same in that sense. They want, there to be an oppressor, an oppressed class. And I don't think the existence of cultural Marxism inhibits capitalism at all. And in fact, it probably helps it, because if you tell women they are being oppressed by the patriarchy and they need to be out there earning money, well, they're not going to be a stay-at-home mom. So they're out there earning money. They're in the labor supply. They're spending money. If you put all the women to work, your GDP should, in theory, go up, right? And that would be good for capitalism, but it also still exists with this idea of cultural Marxism. And that is my rant on capitalism, neoliberalism, and cultural Marxism.
No. Well, I was thinking, like, I agree in the sense that I think they all play into each other. It's not like it's not just, capitalism has caused, the decline in capitalism, or the, the whole trans, the story hour, the everything that we're seeing as far as, all these cultural, like that, like global homo, things like that. I don't think that's like a direct result from just capitalism. Like, oh, this is naturally where capitalism would lead. No, not really.
There's a lot of stuff that is definitely doesn't make sense that it is where capitalism would directly lead. And right. That's another thing they posit, that this is the like the, what do they say? It's kind of like the normal consequences or standard conclusion of capitalism.
Right. This is like where a capitalist society leads. This is This is the natural consequence. No, not so much. There's definitely a cultural Marxism factor that's pushing these agendas. It's pushing these identities onto certain people, or like you said, kind of splitting the population, kind of driving people apart and trying to separate different entities. Like, what do you identify as? Yes, there's always going to be like a commodification of certain identities for people to like latch onto things, right? Mm-hmm. And that plays with capitalism in a positive way for capitalists anyway, because you're making markets of people essentially, right? Like, you're making these markets. They didn't, if you think about the whole trans movement, LGBT, how much did that blow up? That's a result of like advertising, capitalism, making these identities that they knew people would kind of buy into. Certain people anyway. I don't think that it's been that profitable for every company, but obviously it kind of is, since everyone's doing like Gay Pride Month. It's like there's a meme about like, June 1st, all of a sudden all the companies have adopted, the flags, and then, July 1st, it's all gone. That's the capitalism part. The cultural Marxism part is different. That's what you see in like, education and media. So I think they all play into each other. It's not like one is the cause of everything.
Right. There's these different strands, and they're kind of operating together, and they intersect in various ways. There's a lot that when I wrote that article about race mixing and advertising, and one of the conclusions in the follow-up article, part 2 of it, was that a lot of these race mixing things that are pushed are not profitable whatsoever, but they do it anyway. so like diversity in comic books and diversity in video games caused comic book studios and video game studios to lose money. Same with, I talked about just the amount of different combinations you could have of diversity of races if you wanted to sell to more people that aren't done. There was, I think it was the NFL was pushing Black Lives Matter and their viewership declined. There are all these instances where you see a company that ostensibly is operating and in the business of for profit, but they make decisions to do something that is kind of more cultural Marxist, and they lose money from it. So if they were just staunch capitalist, like they would just be pursuing profit as the highest order. And what's interesting to me is how it intersects with like shareholder primacy. So some of these companies are doing this at their own detriment, and in theory, a shareholder could sue them for not maximizing profit properly and doing these global homo things, but nobody's going to actually do it because of where we're at politically. So I think that's a case where this cultural Marxism, this agitating blacks against whites and men against women, takes priority over the capitalist and shareholder primacy bit. So sometimes you see one ideology or goal taking precedent over the other, and they kind of flow in and out, and sometimes one's more popular and sometimes the other one's more popular. They're just fluid. In a different situation, it might call for a company to be a little bit more cultural Marxist, or call for it to be a little bit more shrewdly capitalist. But these terms all mean something different and can be used to describe something different. And I don't think any of them are necessarily wrong. I mean, I'll tell you, if when I think of cultural capitalism, they were talking about, there was people talking about it as the degeneration of culture, which I don't think that's necessarily the case. But I think the idea of planned obsolescence and getting a new iPhone every year, if somebody like that, to me, if I think of the term, if cultural capitalism as a term is going to have any meaning, it's going to be something like that, where everything freaking breaks and everything's planned to have a short life cycle. That's probably a mindset that is something like cultural capitalism, with companies planning to have growth every quarter and never just figuring to make money without growth. Just, hey, here's how much we make. Here's our market share. Here's our sales. Here's our profit margin. Let's just ride that forever. Nobody's done that. Coca-Cola has never said, like, we did X billion in sales and we want to keep it at X billion. It's always X plus one. Every year is X plus one. And they never say, you know what, I think if we just hold it here, maybe we can do some things down the line that increase efficiency, increase productivity. That'll perhaps boost profits, but we're not going to. Our goal isn't X plus one sales next year. It's X again, or maybe X minus one, and we're going to try to we're going to make up for in efficiency, or doing things a little differently, or streamlining some supply lines. You don't ever see that. It's always like more and more and more. And that could be a cultural that capitalism has engendered, but it's not, to describe the agitation of man versus women or white versus black as capitalism is just totally erroneous. And I think it was people reaching for some hot take to stay relevant. And I think that's all I have to say on all this. So I'll give you the last word. We'll kind of wrap up the whole stream.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that they're all separate entities and they all function in society. Like, it's kind of ebbs and flows, like you said. One might take precedence over the other, but I think they all exist in their own right and all serve their own purpose. I think one thing that, I'd like to explore more is this notion, which, I would say is directly related to, and maybe not a result of capitalism, but certainly a driver, sort of an antagonist, would be the consumer mindset. It's like, which came first, like the mega consumer, because it's like relatively new, the whole Amazon thing, people just buying tons of junk, getting it delivered, in a day.
Yes.
That didn't exist before. Like
No,
I don't
that
think,
wasn't.
society, a lot of people in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s had this consumer mindset of like, I'm just going to buy up stuff all the time, new products on the
Yes,
market.
the what do they call? Oh, like the retail therapy thing is a newer. I think that's a newer concept.
Right, right.
Where
And
people
so
are
just,
sad and they just like, I broke up with my boyfriend. I need to just go shopping.
I'm just gonna buy plastic. That'll solve everything. But yeah, that's something that really needs to be like delved into. What created, is this a mindset that's normal and natural, or is this created by like capitalism? Is this part of the culture? Like what kind, this is relatively new, and it's not
Hmm.
healthy, and it's obviously directly related to things that are going on in society. A little bit of capitalism, a little bit of cultural Marxism. What's going on there, but that's a whole nother topic.
Right.
But yeah.
Well, I wanted to thank you for joining me on the show and everybody who listened live and after. I think we're going
Thanks
to
for
wrap.
letting me join.
Yeah, of course. We will do another one soon. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. And if I don't see you before Thanksgiving, have a nice Thanksgiving.
Everyone have a good night.
See ya.